record now. And welcome. So my name is Michelle. I'm one of the careers consultants here at the university, and I'm joined today by my colleague Benita, who is one of our peer career supporters. Benita is going to be helping out today, sharing links, answering questions in the Q&A, and just generally supporting the session. Hopefully you can all see my screen and you can see the slides. We're going to make a start there now. A few expectations and ground rules, if you like, before we begin. So the first thing to say is that interactivity and participation is really encouraged today. We'll be asking questions. You'll have the chance to ask questions as well. We'll be using the chat for interactivity rather than Menti, as it says on the screen. But if you're asking a question, what I'm going to ask you to do is to use the Q&A function only. Please don't use the chat function to ask questions because we won't be able to pick them up. So to access the Q&A, if you can't see it already in your menu bar, if you go to the More icon and then click Q&A, that should show up. You can ask questions directly, but you can also ask questions anonymously as well. And we'll either type a reply directly to you or we'll answer it live in the session. In terms of questions, there's no such thing as a silly question. I know people say that all the time, but this is your chance to ask questions. So if you've looked at the application form already, or there's something that's been bothering you, this is your chance to ask. So please ask any questions, big or small, throughout. And as I've already mentioned, we'll be recording the session. Okay, so this is what we're hoping to cover today. We're going to think about the job description for the Find a Solution internship that you're applying to, and think about how you can use that and then match up to your own experiences to help you demonstrate the criteria really effectively. We're going to be thinking about something called the STAR method, which is something that we ask you to use for the biggest part of the application form. And then we're going to walk you through the questions one by one. So we're literally going to take the application form step by step, highlight any common mistakes that often appear, any pitfalls that students sometimes fall into. So hopefully that means that you don't fall into them and you're able to put in a really excellent application and get yourself to interview. The other thing that we're going to do is think about if you have a disability or an essential need that needs addressing during the application process. We're going to think about how you tell us about that and the sorts of adjustments that you can ask for as well. So hopefully that's what you're expecting from today. Just a quick recap. So if you came to the session last week with my colleague Aaron, he talked a lot about choosing the right internship to apply to and making sure that you were eligible. So just to recap, out of all of the applications that we received in September 2024, so that academic year, 33% of those applications were immediately disregarded and unsuccessful because students had applied for internships that they were not eligible for. So I'm just going to stress that again. Before you start the application form, double check that you are eligible. And the way to check that you're eligible is to check what year of study the internship is open to and what academic discipline. Lots of the Find a Solution internships are open to all academic disciplines, all colleges and schools, and most academic years, but a few of them are more specific. So please check that really carefully before you spend lots of time on an application. And if you're unsure whether you're eligible or not, just email us, studentopportunitieshub@glasgow.ac.uk, and we can check that before you get started. Please don't contact the organisations directly, contact us and we'll be able to help. And just another note on eligibility if you're an international student. As you will likely know through your visa status, EU students must have EU settlement scheme or pre-settled status or a student visa to work in the UK. And for any other international students, you must check your individual visa to check that you're allowed to work in the UK. For the majority of international students, you are able to work up to 20 hours a week, but you just need to check that really carefully. And the other thing to be aware of is that you must be based in the UK for most of the academic year to be able to apply for an internship. And you must have a term time address that's in the UK. And if you're not sure about any of that or you want to check anything related to your visa, the International Student Support Team can do that for you. So they can check and make sure that you're eligible to work in the UK and to apply for an internship before you do. So hopefully we've not got any questions about that so far, because that was very much a recap from the last workshop. But if you do have any questions, just put them into the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer them as we go through the session. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is accessibility. Before you start an application, you might look at the application form and you might realise that the application form isn't accessible to you. So I want to touch on that first before we start going through the questions one by one. If you have a disability, and that includes any kind of disability, whether that's a long-term health condition, a mental health condition, or any other kind of disability or neurodivergent condition, anything at all like that, it's up to you whether you choose to share that during the recruitment process for your internship. So you're not obligated to share it, it's your choice. We would say that it is usually better to share your disability if you think it's going to impact your application or your performance in the role in any way. And what I mean by that is if you think you need some sort of adjustment to help you do the role to the best of your ability. So choosing whether or not to disclose is up to you. And the other thing that you get to choose is when you share that with the Student Opportunities Hub or with the employer. So you can share that at any stage, whether that's during the application process, when you're invited to interview, or even after accepting an offer. It's not lying, it's not hiding something if you choose to share it at a later date. That is your entitlement to do so. If you'd like to share details of your disability during the application process, then the way to do that is to email studentopportunitieshub@glasgow.ac.uk. Please don't put it in your application, please email separately. And alongside that, you need to tell us what sort of adjustments you're looking for. So what sort of adjustments to that recruitment process that would make that process more fair and equitable for you. It's also worth noting that during the recruitment process, the recruiter cannot ask for any evidence or any further details of your disability. The only time that they might be allowed to do that is once you've been accepted for the role and once you're in role, if they need some evidence to be able to put the proper adjustments in place. So it's up to you whether or not you share. And in terms of requesting adjustments, adjustments, we use that word all the time, but what that means is a change either to the application process or the way of working that removes barriers that you might face during that process. So adjustments are personal, they should be based on what you need, and they should help to make that process more accessible or more fair for you. So there's no prescribed list of what you can or cannot ask for. It's about thinking, what barriers do I face during this process, and what will help me to remove those barriers? What adjustments do I need? So some examples that we've seen in the past is where students have asked for the application form to be in a different format, or they might have asked us to see the interview questions in advance, or they might request a particular kind of space or time of day for an interview. So they're just some examples. They're not the only things that you can ask for, but you will be the best person to know what adjustments you need. And it's up to you really to share that with the Student Opportunities Hub so we can get those put in place for you. And if you're struggling to know whether or not to share or what adjustments you might ask for, then we've got a partnership with an organisation called Employability. So they work alongside us and they are trained professionals to give advice on disclosing disabilities and seeking adjustments. You can access their service for free as a University of Glasgow student. All you need to do is register with them online, and then you can book a one-to-one chat with them, and they can give you some advice and help you think about what sort of adjustments you might ask for or how you might approach this. It's worth noting that they're not careers advisors, so for any other careers advice, you come to us, but for anything around sharing your disability or seeking adjustments, you go to Employability for that. And we can advise on that as well to a certain extent. So that's all about adjustments. If you've got any questions about that, of course, put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer them. But what I'm going to do now is start to go through the application form question by question, and I have included every single question in the slides today. We've run the session a little bit longer, so we've got 90 minutes to make sure that we can cover every question in enough detail. So we might not use all of that time, but we will if we need to. If you've got any questions about any of these points, please do get them in sooner rather than later so that we can address the questions as we go. But this is a summary of the application form for the majority of Find a Solution internships. So we have a standard application form for all of our internships. Occasionally, an employer will ask us to alter that form in some way or to add an additional question. So for your particular application, you might see one or two additional questions alongside this. And if you need advice on that, I'm going to tell you how to get that advice later in the session. But these are the standard questions. So there's a question asking you to tick that you're eligible for the application and to confirm that you're currently based in the UK. Then you've got some basic questions around your contact details, around your studies, and then you've got some longer questions that you need to think a bit more carefully about. And they're questions around your work experience or other experience, your reasons for applying to that particular internship, and then how you meet the criteria. And then towards the end, you've got some more simple questions again, where we ask you to tell us about any holidays that you've got booked and any details of references that you're going to share for the application. So what I'm going to do is work through these questions one by one and give you tips and pointers to help you along the way. Okay. So the first question I'm going to come on to is the current university studies, and that is because the first three questions are really basic, ticking that you're eligible, ticking that you're based in the UK, and then sharing your email address and your phone number. So I don't need to go through those one by one. They're really straightforward. But the next question looks like this. So it says, please clearly list whether you're an undergraduate student, a postgrad taught student, or a researcher, and then where relevant, include your year of study. Please also tell us your degree discipline, and then please list the modules relevant to the internship that you have studied this year and give the grades achieved if known. So what you need to do, first of all, is tell us what year of study are you. So you might be a second year undergraduate student, or you might be a PGT student. Then you need to tell us your academic discipline. And then when you're listing the modules, the really important word there is the relevant modules. So any modules where you've learned something or you've used a skill that is relevant to the internship that you're applying to. And this is how it might look when you write it in the application form. So you can see here this student has said they're an undergraduate, third year student studying psychology, and then they've listed some relevant modules that they've taught, that they've learned. So we've got an undergraduate module focusing on a quantitative project and an undergraduate module on statistical and scientific models. Now this person was applying for a researcher role. So the internship that they were applying to was based on research. So they've listed modules where they've learned about research techniques and research skills. You only need to list the modules from the last academic year. So if you're a third year student, you'll list your modules from this year, but not from first or second year. So it's just the recent ones. Hopefully there aren't too many questions about that, but if there are, let us know. But that one's quite straightforward. We just need really basic information. Something else that you could do here, if it's not clear how that module relates to the internship, is you could write a really brief bullet point explaining. So you could say, for example, in this module, I used my research skills, or I demonstrated my presentation skills because I presented a project, or whatever it might be. So if you need to add a sentence just to tell us why it's relevant, then please do that, but don't feel like you have to. Now, the next question is the one that takes a little bit longer than the previous one. So, this is where you start to add some detail to your application and really help the employer understand who you are. And this question asks you to give concise detail of any current or previous work experience. And it says this can include any voluntary work or any other extracurricular positions you've held, and then focus on your main responsibilities and what you gained from the experience. Now, when you're talking about your experiences in this section, you need to do it with the job description in mind. So think about the role that you're applying to and the skills and the essential criteria needed for that role, and think about the responsibilities you'd have in that role if you're successful, and then write about your previous experience in a way that demonstrates those skills. So, for example, if I'm applying for a role where excellent communication skills or the ability to engage with the public are essential criteria, and I've worked part-time at KFC, what I'm not going to do is write put orders through the till or served customers. What I am going to write is a sentence about how I communicated with the public to take orders. So I'm using the language of the job description to try and talk about my achievements and my skills in a way that is relevant to the role. And we've given you a really clear indication of how we want you to lay that out. So we want you at the top to start with your most recent position or activity and then work backwards in reverse chronological order. So we also want you to state the name of the employer first and the dates that you were employed. Then tell us what your role was or what your job title was, and then give us some bullet points of your responsibilities, and do that for every role that you're including. And an example of how this might look is on the next slide. So this one here. So if this person is trying to demonstrate the criteria of effective team working or planning their own workload or working on their own initiative, what they could do if they were a social media intern, they could write University of Glasgow, which is the employer, the dates that they were employed, and notice we've just got the months and the years here, so make sure you include that level of detail, and then we've got their job title. And then the bullet points talk about what they did in that role with the essential criteria in mind. So they've talked here about independently managing a posting schedule, so that relates to planning their own workload. And then they've got collaboration with fellow interns, which is that effective team working. So they've talked about what they've done in a way that is relevant to the role. And just another note on this, when we're thinking about work experience and what counts, it isn't just about talking about any other internships you've done. There'll be lots of people on the call that have never had an internship, and this might be the first one that they're trying to get. So when you're thinking about work experience, this can involve any paid or unpaid work, and that includes casual part-time jobs, so your typical student jobs in cafes or bars or restaurants or shops. It can include any previous professional experience you've had, especially if you're a mature student and you're going through a career change. You can talk about your previous roles and the skills that you've used and the ones that might be transferable. Any unpaid work that you've done, so any volunteering, any involvement in community groups or clubs or societies, and that includes ones outside of university. So if you're involved in your local football club and you help organise the social activity, that counts. If you are involved in your local church or other religious organisation, that counts. So any kind of experience you've had matters, especially if it's helping you to demonstrate skills. So make sure that you include anything that is relevant there. And if you are someone that maybe doesn't have quite as much work experience, but you've got other life experience that helps you demonstrate skills, you can include that here as well. So that might be about, being a parent or being an unpaid carer for a relative or a family member. All of that kind of life experience can be used here as well. So that's the work experience question. Benita, have we had any questions come in on that so far?
We have three questions. So one of them I'd accidentally clicked that it was done, but I can read it out. Someone has asked, do the references need to be submitted by the 14th or if they can be sent in later?
Okay, so we'll come on to the references section later in the call, but ideally they need to be submitted as part of the application form, so by the 14th.
All right. Another member has asked, can I include the courses slash certifications that they had taken in Coursera recently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, on an ordinary application, there might be a question about this where you get to put them separately. I wouldn't include those in the work experience section, but what I would do is use them when I'm trying to demonstrate the essential criteria in the later question, which we'll come on to. So, that is where you can use courses that you've done or online modules that you've taken in your STAR examples to help demonstrate the essential criteria for the role. So that would be my advice to do that there. Yeah, good question.
We have a question about the modules for postgrad students. So if they have to give a description of the work that they're doing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the form is designed primarily to support people who are on taught courses. So I recognise that that question isn't the most appropriate for a PGR student. What I would do there is, yeah, give a brief outline of your research topic or your research project, and then I would briefly list any smaller projects or aspects of the work that you're doing that are relevant to the role. So if you're applying for a research assistant role, fantastic. You know, briefly demonstrate your research capability or the kind of research that you're doing. If you're applying for a role where communication is relevant, briefly outline any presentations or any conferences you've attended. So rather than listing everything about your PhD, pull out the relevant aspects or the relevant elements of the work and think about your PhD as a job. What aspects of that job are you going to pull out to help demonstrate the criteria? We've got some more
There are,
questions coming in, Benita.
yeah, 5 more questions. Would you like me to go over them or?
Yeah, if yeah, let's do them. So I've got them up in front of me here, so I'll just quickly whiz through them, Benita, if that's okay. So question about being a master's student and you didn't study undergraduate here. Should you mention your undergraduate study? So in that's an anonymous question that's come in, but in this section where you're talking about your current studies, you only need to list your current masters and any relevant aspects of that masters that are relevant to the role. However, if in the later questions where you're trying to demonstrate the essential criteria, you want to draw on examples from your undergraduate study, so you might have done a project with a group and you might want to be using it to demonstrate teamwork, or you might have presented a paper that you wrote to somebody in a module, and that might help you demonstrate communication skills. Then you can draw on your undergraduate study to give you STAR examples. But for this current studies question, I wouldn't. I would just focus on your masters because it's asking for your current studies only. So hopefully that answers that question. We've got another one from Paulina. Should we include all our work experience or should we limit the number to 2 or 3? So, Paulina, that's a really good question. Generally, the rule of thumb is in any job application is to go back no more than 10 or 15 years. But most importantly, is that you're only talking about work experience or activities that help you demonstrate your suitability for the role. So I'm assuming that you're asking that question because you've got quite a bit of work experience, in which case what I would do is pick the ones that most help you demonstrate the role. If that is, if you have had 6 jobs over the last 5 to 10 years and they all are relevant in some way, then include them. There's no word limit, so you can include as much as you like. But I wouldn't go back any more than sort of 10 to 15 years as a rule of thumb. What you could do, Paulina, is if you've got lots of experience and you're worried about gaps, which I would try not to worry about because it's an internship, it's for students. We know that lots of students aren't going to have this perfect work record or history. But if you are worried about that, you could include a subheading, and you could maybe list your relevant work experience and make it clear that you've just cherry picked the most relevant roles. So hopefully that answers that question for you, Paulina. We've got questions about references, so what we'll do is we'll leave them open and we'll come back to them, Benita, when we get onto them, if that's okay.
All right.
So we've got one here from Katra for the work experience section. They want to know about the most recent job. If you have a long work history, how many jobs should you include? So Katra, hopefully I've just answered that question for you there. So hopefully that's given you everything that you need to be able to sort of address that. So that one's done. And then we've got, how should we list course grades from this semester when we don't have grades back yet in the relevant modules list? Yep, so as you can see on the example on screen, if you don't have the grade, you just write grade unknown. So on the application form, it says it's better to write grade unknown than not applicable. So just write grade unknown if you're not sure. That's absolutely fine. We've got other questions about references, which we'll come back to. And I think that's everything for now, isn't it, Benita?
I believe so. There was a question about accessing the slides again, so I'm going to reshare the link if that's okay.
Fantastic. And what I'll do is I'll just email the slides out to everyone on the call afterwards as well. So if you can't access them through the link for whatever reason, don't worry, and we'll make sure that they get to you. All right, fantastic. So let's move on then, and let's think about the next question. So we've covered the work experience, and you've got your example there. When you're looking at that example, just before we move on, you'll notice that the bullet points have started with a powerful action word or a verb. So we've got managed the posting schedule, and we've got collaborated with fellow interns. So writing your bullet points in that statement format rather than in long sentences helps you to demonstrate the skills that you used in that experience. So that is much better for the employer to be able to skim through and find what they're looking for. So rather than writing, I was responsible for managing the posting schedule, you just write manage the posting schedule. So get straight to the point and write your bullet points in sort of statement format rather than long sentences. Okay, so we'll move on and we'll think about the next question. So the next two questions on the application form are by far the trickiest. So we're going to spend a little bit longer thinking about these and about how you address them. So the next question is about your motivation or your reasons for applying to that particular role. So the question says, please address in detail your motivations for applying for this specific internship, and make sure that you tell us about your enthusiasm for or your knowledge of the role, the organisation, and any other relevant information. So any relevant experience that you've had, how that internship links with your future career goals, things like that. So this is your chance to show the employer that you've done your research, that you're not just applying for 20 internships, that you've picked the ones that you're really passionate about, you've researched the employer, and that you really understand why you're applying. So this is your chance to show that off. And also to talk about how this internship fits in with your longer term goals or with your career plans. So what sometimes students do, and they fall into the trap of doing, is being really, really honest with this and only really focusing on what the benefits are to them. So they'll say things like, I need this internship because I need some experience in the charity sector, or I haven't got any research experience yet and I want to develop that. Or they might say even things like, I want to use my summer well, I want to earn some money over the summer and develop skills. None of those things are bad things to say, on their own, but if you're only focusing on the things that benefit you for this internship, and you're not talking about what you bring to the table, or you're not talking about why you're interested in that particular role or that organisation, that employer isn't going to want to read the rest of your application. So there's a right way to do this, and that is really sort of doing your research, thinking about the role, thinking about the organisation, and being really clear about why you want to apply, but also what you're hoping to bring to the table. So to help us explore this in a bit more detail and also just to get a little bit of interactivity going, because I know it's hard to listen to someone talk at you for an hour and a half, we're going to look at an example. So what we've got on screen, and Benita is going to share a link to this in the chat as well. Hopefully this link will work. We're going to look at some examples for answering this question. So Benita's going to share that link and I'm going to bring it up on screen as well. So when we look at the link, what I've done here is I've copied the job description for the fundraising coordinator internship with Include Me To Club. Now I know that this is one of the internships that's been really popular, and which is why I've selected it. Now, first of all, in that document, you've got the job description. And I've just highlighted a few really key bits here. So first of all, at the very top, we've got the eligibility criteria. So this is open for everyone from second year through to fifth year undergraduate, and PGTs and PGRs from all colleges. So that's the bit that shows you whether or not you're eligible. So the only people that aren't eligible are first years for this role. Then if we scroll down, we've got the essential criteria and the desirable criteria, and we're going to come back to that later. But then we've got this whole section which was about the organisation that tells us about the Include Me To Club. So this is your starting point really for helping understand that and then using that in your motivation answer. And there's a link here to a full employer profile where you can read more about that employer. What you've then got are two examples of a motivation answer. So we've got example statement 1, which is here. And then on the last page, we've got example 2. And what I want you to do, I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to read through these examples. And I want you to tell me which one you think is better, 1 or 2. And I'd like you to do that in the chat, please. So I'm going to enable the chat so that everyone can speak. And I want you just to tell me which one do you think is better. And then if you'd like to, you can tell me why you think that. And there's no right or wrong answers here. There's no judgment at all. But just have a go. Which one do you think is better and why? And whilst you're doing that, I'm going to answer some of these reference questions by text. You can all see answers to any questions that we've typed a response to. So, if you're curious and you want to have a look at any of the answers that we've given, you can all do that in the Q&A section. All right, I'm just going to give you another minute to do this. I can see that some answers have started to come in, which is great. So we've got some people telling us which one they think is better and why. So that's really good to see. Thank you to those of you that have started to share your opinions there. I'm going to give you one more minute to have a look, and then we'll chat about these. And I agree with everything that's come in so far. So thank you to Fiona and No Sakari and Dan. Thank you for your responses there. Absolutely spot on. All right, everyone. So feel free to keep reading if you've not yet finished, but I am going to start to talk us through these examples now. So example statement one, lots of information here around what this person hopes to get from the internship. So that is, that is good. And they're talking about how the role will benefit them. So they want to learn more about fundraising. They want to learn about events and they want to improve their skills, which is really good. But what they haven't done here is tailor their answer to the role. So not once have they mentioned Include Me Too Club, and they've not mentioned the role title anywhere. So it feels like this statement could have been written for any internship, really. They've not really tailored it all that well. And the other thing that they haven't done is shown that they understand the organisation. So they've not read up on the Include Me Too Club. They haven't shown their knowledge of them. They haven't talked about what they particularly like about that organisation. And they've not really talked about how this links specifically to their goals. So they've said it will help me understand what I might want to do in the future, but they've not really given very much detail there. When we come on to reference to example number 2, this one is a lot better, and everything that has been said in the chat is right. So Fiona is correct. It is much more specific to the role, but also the organisation. So they've talked about the role and the breadth of the role and all the different activities that they'll get to do and how that will benefit them. But they've also talked about what they like about the Include Me Too Club. So they've talked about the organisation's mission and what their goal is and how that links with what they're interested in. So yeah, absolutely, Fiona. No, Sakaria said it's well structured and it demonstrates genuine motivation for the role. And you're right. So they've started to talk about the organisation and the mission of the organisation. Then they've talked really clearly about the role and what interests them about the role. And then they've talked about their relevant experience and how that links with the role. And then they've talked about their future goals and how this role fits in. So very well structured, really easy to follow. And then Dana said, they've talked about what they're interested in and why, whereas the first one has only said what they want to take from the role. Absolutely. And Janelle, Findlay, yeah, absolutely. All of these comments are correct. So statement 2 is a lot better. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of what you need to do to make your motivation stand out. And if we think about that, what you need to do is really understand the specific role and talk about what interests you about that role. And the role responsibilities will help you do that in the job description. Then you need to talk about your knowledge of the organisation and don't just use the employer profile that we've given you. Go and have a look. Try and find their website. Find the About section on the website and read about the organisation. Think about what stands out for you and what makes that organisation special. And then try to draw out or make connections with any previous experience you've had, any interest areas that you've got that are relevant, and then finally link it to your future career goals. And if you do all of those things, you're going to have a really strong motivation statement. And the word limit for most of them is 400 words. That's almost one side of A4. So maximize your word count, make use of it, and really give us that detail that we're looking for. You need to be really sort of detailed and go into a lot of explanation about why you want the role to be considered and to be shortlisted. Have we had any questions come in, Benita, about the motivation statement?
We haven't had any specific to that, but we do have a question about applying for multiple roles. I was about to answer it, but if you would like to answer it as well, that's completely fine.
Yeah, so I will answer it just because it's a good question and it's one that, other people might want to hear the answer to. So this person has asked, can I apply for more than one role? Can I apply for multiple jobs? And if I get an internship, can I take another part-time job? And the short answer is usually yes. But as an international student, you need to make sure that the number of hours you're working in a week does not exceed your entitlement. And what you can't do there is front load hours or not have hours one week, but then do 30 hours the next. So each week you can't do any more than your visa allows. And that's usually 20 hours a week. So if you've taken an internship and that internship is for 6 hours a week, in theory, if your visa allows you to, you could then take a second job as long as your hours don't go over your allocation in any week. So that's the thing to be aware of and to consider. And you are allowed to apply for multiple roles. What we said in the first workshop is try to shortlist because we see students that apply for 30 internships all at once and you just can't do a good enough job on the application. You just can't write 30 fantastic applications in 2 weeks. It's not possible. So our advice is to shortlist and aim to apply for, a maximum of 5 if you can. And just to be aware of that and put really good application in. And there's a question that's come in that says, what if I plan to have a short summer trip for a few days during the internship? Is it possible to adjust? So in most cases, yes. And what we encourage you to do is to share any details of holidays that you've got booked with us in advance. That is standard process when you apply for a job. You share any commitments that you've already got ahead of time so that the employer knows, and then they can work around that. The specifics of that will depend on the role. So if you're working in a role and let's say you're working on an event and that event is taking place over 3 specific days, and then you're not available on those days, that isn't going to work. You're not going to be able to do the role. But in most cases, these roles have been designed with students in mind. So they've been designed to be flexible. So read the requirements of the role, really understand what hours are needed, share details of any commitments or holidays that you've got booked in advance, and then have those conversations with the employer as early as possible, would be my advice. That's a good question. Okie dokie. So what we're going to do now is move on and we're going to think about the next question, which is I would argue every question on the application form is important, but this question is the one that is going to get you shortlisted or not. This is the one that really, really matters alongside your motivation. This is the one that is going to help you get to interview. And in that same time period that I talked about earlier, where 33% of applications were disregarded because the student wasn't eligible, 59% of those applications, that's not incorrect, that's the right number, 59% were not shortlisted or they were unsuccessful because they didn't address all of the essential criteria for the role in this next question, or because they didn't give enough examples, enough evidence, or enough detail. So this next question really, really matters. And it matters that you put the right amount of detail and effort into it if you want to be shortlisted for interview. So the next question is the one around how you meet the essential and desirable criteria. So we're just going to have a little look at that job description again, just to see what the essential and desirable criteria are. So I'm going to bring up that job description. And if I scroll up, I can see here at the start of the role, we've got duties and responsibilities. Now, what some students do by mistake is they try and demonstrate how they can do all of these duties, but that isn't what we're asking you to do. What we're asking you to do is to show your evidence that you meet all of the essential criteria and as many of the desirable criteria as you can. And you'll know that you're looking at the right place because they will be numbered E1, E2, E3, and so on. So all of the essential criteria start with E, all of the desirable criteria start with D. and then named so that you can name them also in this part of the application form so that you can make reference to them. And you need to make sure that you address every single one of the essential criteria. Don't miss any out, and as many of the desirable criteria as you have. So that's the first thing to say. Please don't make the mistake of trying to show your evidence of the duties. You need to focus on the essential criteria. So this one here, we've got a genuine interest in the work of the Me Too Club and a commitment to inclusion. We've got organisational skills, communication skills, team working, proactive and flexible approach, willingness to support events, willingness to work occasional evenings and weekends, IT skills, and reliability and punctuality. And then we've got some desirable criteria as well. So this is the bit that we're addressing in this question. And the tip here is you need to address all of them if you're going to be shortlisted. So this is the primary way that the Student Opportunities Hub team will filter the applications, and the primary way that the employer will decide who to interview and who to not take through to the next stage. So addressing them all one by one. And the way to do that is by giving specific examples of when you've used that skill in the past with lots of detail. So really going into detail, I'm going to talk about how to do that in a minute and how to structure it. But the first thing I just want to talk about is how you structure your answer more broadly. So you need to make it as easy as possible for the employer to see that you've addressed all the essential criteria. So thinking about how you format this section is really important. Now, there's a few different ways to do this. One of the best ways, in my opinion, and the easiest way for an employer is to use subheadings. So you'll have a subheading that says E1, ability to communicate effectively or whatever it is, followed by your example. And then in the next paragraph, you'll have E2 and so on. That usually works in most cases. You can group criteria together if that is useful, but please make sure that you evidence both of those criteria really clearly. Sometimes when people group criteria together, so they give one example that addresses E1 and E4, sometimes that means that they only give enough evidence for E1 and not E4 or the other way around. So just be really careful if you are going to group them that you give appropriate level of evidence for each. Now, some examples of how you might do this. Headings. One of the easiest, one of the clearest ways to do this. So you write the heading, which is the criteria from the job description, word for word, and then you follow with your example. The other way that you can do this is you can reference the criteria in your paragraph. So we can see here, in my role as barista at Starbucks, I developed strong communication skills, and then they've made a reference to S1 here. So they've got S1 in brackets. Or the other thing that you could do, which is less obvious and harder for the employer to find, but sometimes reads like with more flow, is to use a pointer sentence either at the start or the end of the paragraph. So you might start your paragraph by saying, I developed my strong communication skills when, or you might finish with, this shows how I have used my strong communication skills. So they're the three ways that we recommend that you make this clear. But my advice to make it as easy as possible and as clear as possible is to use headings for each criteria and put your example underneath. Now, when you're writing your examples, one of the best ways to do this for almost all criteria is the STAR method. And this is the method we ask you to use on the application form. So STAR is an acronym and it stands for situation, task, actions, and then result. And you can see here that I've given a suggested sort of percentage of how big each part of your answer should be. And the situation and the task should be the smallest part. So that is where you're just giving context. So in my role at Starbucks, I was responsible for this, or I needed to, or I worked on this project. That's the smallest part of your answer. The actions part should be the biggest. And this is where you break down everything you did that demonstrates that skill. So let's say you're trying to demonstrate time management. You need to talk about 3 to 5 things that you did specifically that showed good time management. So that could be time blocking your calendar, writing a priorities list. It could be setting time aside for ongoing tasks, whatever it might be. And then the results section is the impact that your actions had. So because you did these things, because you blocked your calendar and you prioritized tasks and you made time for longer tasks and so on, what was the result? What was the impact on you or your team or the project or whatever it might be? And then what you can also do at the end is link that example back to the role. So this is sometimes called Star Plus. So once you've given your example of when you've used that skill in the past, you can then go back to your application and think, why are they asking me for this skill? So if I'm going for this role, why are they asking me for research skills? How will I be using them in the role? And you can just add a sentence at the end. So, for example, I can use my communication skills to build relationships with partner charities and other stakeholders. And this shows them that you really understand the role and you know why they're asking for those skills. So we've just got the acronym here as a reminder. And there's some questions that have come in about tricky criteria, so I'll come on to them in a minute. And here's an example. So for a standard one, like good communication skills, written and verbal, we've got the situation where someone has volunteered at a local community group that supported young people, and they were planning a small fundraising event, but communication was inconsistent. So this person took on the task of improving communication for everyone. Then they've broken down in their actions how they communicated effectively. So they wrote a clear communication plan. They drafted friendly emails to volunteers outlining their role, their timings and contacts. They created a briefing document. They set up a group chat and they made sure to check in with volunteers individually. So they've listed 4 or 5 really specific actions that they took that demonstrated good communication. And then they've talked about the result. So the event ran smoothly, the volunteers felt prepared, the team gave positive feedback, and the comments said that it helped to reduce anxiety and made the experience more enjoyable, which then helped them to achieve their fundraising target. So they've given really specific results. Now, this method and this STAR method will work for the majority of criteria, any that are skills based. Now we've got questions that have come in like, how should we address criteria for interest in something? Haven't seen any examples of the STAR method for this. And then we've got another one that says, can you give an example of a STAR result response to criteria like have a willingness to work late or have an interest in working in inclusive environments? So to take Jan's examples first of all, if it says a willingness to work late, what you could do is draw upon a previous experience you've had where you've needed to work flexibly or where your hours have needed to adapt. So that could be when you've been managing studies with a part-time job, for example, or where you've managed caring responsibilities alongside your study and you've had to juggle. So demonstrating your adaptability in another way. Now, the best example will be where you've been adaptable and you've had to work late or you've had to do specifically what they're asking. But if you haven't got that specific example, think about the broader skill. So a willingness to work late is a willingness to be flexible and adaptable with your time and to sort of adapt to the needs of the organisation. So think about a time where you've done that before. If you don't have an example, what you could do is use the STAR method to talk about what your approach would be in the role. So you would start by saying, in this role, I understand that I will need to work late because events might take place in the evening or whatever. If I was successful, here's what I do to make sure that I was adaptable. So I'd share my availability in advance. I'd check in about timings. I'd keep, I'd learn about what events were coming up in advance and I try to move things around and adjust my schedule to suit. So you can talk about it from a perspective point of view rather than looking backwards. But I would only do that if you haven't got a previous example that can demonstrate that skill. So hopefully, Jan, that kind of tackles your side to that question. And then for the anonymous question around an interest in something, again, what you could do is give a star example of when you have worked in this area in the past. So, for example, in this one, we've got an interest in inclusion. You could give a star example of a time where you've worked on a project that was working on inclusion, or where you've engaged in an inclusive environment and helped to make that environment more inclusive, or where you've followed policies and guidelines to maintain the level of inclusivity. So you can draw upon a previous example to demonstrate your interest. Or again, you could go prospectively. So you could say that you've got the interest, and then you could talk about the way that you've developed that interest, or you've developed your knowledge of that area. So you could talk about, for example, understanding the organization's values in relation to inclusion, or you could talk about how you have read and understood the inclusive policies of the university and you've followed those whilst you've been a student. So it is still drawing upon previous examples, but maybe in a different context. Hopefully that answers that question, Anonymous, and Jan as well. So I'm just going to mark those as answered. And then we've got another one. If, for instance, research skills are mentioned as an essential criteria and I've developed them in more than one role, how do I synthesize all of this as part of the STAR method? That's a great question. So for most examples, for most criteria, you want to pick one strong example. You don't need to give all your examples. So if you are a research student or you've developed research skills in more than one role, pick one role and use your STAR method to do that. You could then follow up with another sentence or two that says, I've developed these skills further in this role, and then talk about how you maybe used your research skills in a different way. Or you could say, I've developed my research skills across a variety of roles. One example of this is, and then talk about the specific. But the STAR method is designed to focus on one example. Now, if you've got lots of experience, what might be really helpful is before you start writing your answers, is to go down all the criteria and just jot, what are my examples for each of these criteria? How many examples have I got? And then if, for example, one of the criteria, you've got 5 examples that you could draw from, but maybe 3 of those examples could be better used elsewhere to demonstrate different criteria, then use those examples elsewhere and focus on the 2 that are specific to that skill. So you want to try and include a variety of examples across the whole application if you can. So hopefully that's answered that question. We've got another one that come in that says, if your past experience and the essential and desirable criteria section sounds similar, and I'll be drawing upon the same material, it might sound repetitive. That's fine. If it sounds a little bit repetitive because you're drawing on previous examples, that's okay, because the actions part of each STAR example will be different. So, for example, you might use a part-time job at Primark to demonstrate your time management skills, and also use it to demonstrate your ability to work in a team. The start of your example might be similar, but the actions are going to be different because the action section is going to focus on those different skills. The other thing that you could do is, if the essential and desirable criteria are similar, you could group them and give one STAR example that demonstrates both. So, you might have an essential criteria that is ability to create online material using a variety of sources. And then you might have a desirable criteria that's about creating video content. You might then group them if you've got one example that helps demonstrate, creating online content, including video content. So you could group them in that way. Now, yes, you should write a STAR example for every single criteria. And it doesn't matter how long the application is. We've removed the word limit. So if your job that you're applying for has got 15 criteria, this section is going to be longer for you than someone who is applying for a job that only has 8 criteria. So don't worry too much about word count. You don't want to be writing huge answers that are a page long for every criteria. A good rule of thumb is 150 to possibly 300 words maximum. 150 words is a good rule of thumb for a star example. But don't worry about word limit because we have removed the word limit. Okay, fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move on because I'm conscious of time and I will wrap up any questions that we've not managed to answer. But I'm just going to move on for now. So hopefully that helps you to feel a little bit more confident about that section. So in summary, you need a star example or a detailed paragraph for every single essential criteria and as many of the desirable criteria as you can. You need to give lots of detail and evidence. You need to structure your answer really clearly using headings or pointers or references so that we know which criteria you're addressing. And if you want to, you can group criteria together if that's going to make it easier to not repeat yourself. But it is okay to use the same example more than once to demonstrate a different skill. Most students, especially in the second or third year, they might have only had one or two part-time jobs, and maybe, if they've been really lucky, they've been involved in a club or a society. So you're not going to have 15 things to draw on. You are going to be using the same examples multiple times, but as long as you're using them to demonstrate that specific skill, you should be okay. All right, fantastic. So we're coming up to the final questions at the end of the application form now, and this will, we've got lots of questions that have come in about references. So, hopefully we'll start to address those now. But there's a question around holidays, and it says, make sure you give all dates that you absolutely cannot attend an interview, but try to be as flexible as possible. So for this question, really, why we're asking this is that we can schedule you for an interview at a time that works for you. But you can also use it to share dates of any unavailability further along in the summer. So for example, when you started your internship. The only thing we need to know is your availability over the next month or so April, May. If you want to share more after that, you can. But if not, just make sure you share those with the employer if and when you're successful and as early as possible. And you don't need to give lots of detail. So you might just say, I'm unavailable on Friday mornings due to lectures or due to my volunteering position or due to my part-time job, or I'm unavailable during this week due to a holiday. So you don't need to give lots of detail, just really, really small levels of detail, but make sure that you're really specific with the dates. And then references. So we've had lots of questions that have come in about this. Let's see. So I'm just looking at the questions. So we've got a question from an international student saying, do I need a national insurance number before I apply? Please speak to the international student support team about that question. They'll be able to answer that more specifically. I can't advise you on that. Someone has said that they don't think they can find two references. So does that mean that they're ineligible to apply? What I would say in that case is if you really can't find details of two references, email Student Opportunities Hub at glasgow.ac.uk and ask them what you should do. But where possible, you do need to find two reference details. So references. The question says at least one of these should be a current or a previous employer. And if you don't have any previous work experience, you can include details of two academic referees instead. So your referees can be people that you've worked for. So they can be your current manager or a previous manager or a previous supervisor. It can be an academic that knows you fairly well. So that could be a progress tutor, a personal tutor, a dissertation supervisor, somebody that's taught you for an extensive module or that has had regular interaction with you. But it could also be other people related to other experiences. So if you volunteered, it could be your volunteer manager or whoever supervises at that volunteering position. It could be someone in a position of responsibility at your community organisation where you volunteer, for example. But it needs to be someone that knows you fairly well, that is in a position of seniority, so someone that you've reported to or that's line managed you in some way or that knows you in that capacity. And it can't be a close friend or a family member. So it can be two academics if necessary, but where possible, try and use your previous experience. And these are the details that you need to give. So name, and then the company that they work for or the organisation that they're a part of and their job title, their email address, their telephone number, and their professional address or their private address if that is more relevant to that particular referee. We don't accept references that have been written previously. So if you have a reference letter that you've been given from someone, that usually won't be accepted. So we'll usually contact the referees directly to ask them for a reference in the format that we require. So that does mean potentially if you apply to 5 internships and you're shortlisted for 5 internships or you're offered a position for 3 of them, it might mean that those referees are contacted 5 times or 3 times. The reference requests will come usually through the Student Opportunities Hub. So we'll try to streamline that as much as possible. But hopefully that's answered that question. So yeah, where possible, you do need 2 references, but don't worry too much if you haven't. Contact the Student Opportunities Hub and they'll be able to advise you more clearly. So just a few notes then on references. So thinking about who to ask and when to ask them. So that can be a current or previous employer where possible, academic people where possible, including any advisor of studies, module coordinators, lecturers, or supervisors, and ask the people that know you best. So if you ask an academic that you've never had a one-to-one conversation with, the chances are they're not going to give you a reference. So ask people that you know to some level of detail. And you need to ask for their permission before you submit your application. So you need to ask them now, really, as soon as possible, and get their permission before you add their details to your application. In terms of how to ask, there are some things that you can do to increase your chances of someone saying yes. What I would do is give your full name and remind that person how they know you. If that's an academic, give your student number if that's relevant. And then tell them what position you're applying for, and you can even share a link to the job description if that's helpful. So tell them about the role, tell them what's involved. If you've started an application and you feel comfortable sharing that, that is also something that you could share with them so that they can talk about things that you've highlighted in your application. But mostly it's important that they know what job you're applying for. And then tell them a little bit about how they should expect it. So, tell them that they'll be contacted by the Student Opportunities Hub. And then it's really important to tell them the application deadline as well, so that they've got a rough idea of when they'll be contacted. If you've got a referee that is living outside of the UK, I've just seen that question, absolutely, that's fine. If you want to get both references from a previous employer and you've got 2 managers or supervisors that you can do that for, that is fine as well. If you can try and get them from different places, that's better, but 2 from the same employer is fine. So those questions have answered. And then let's see, is there any more information here? No, that's it. That's all I've got on references. So we've got some more questions that have come in about references. So can it be another student if they're a president of a club you're on the committee of? I would advise no, not unless you're really running out of other options. I would try and choose an academic staff member or a person from a workplace or other sort of volunteering opportunity. That might be one that you email the Student Opportunities Hub about just to check. But I would advise not if you can help it. Could the reference be my previous undergraduate supervisor? If my previous employer is overseas, is that still applicable? So yeah, that's fine. It can be an undergraduate supervisor. It can be a previous employer who's overseas. We'll contact them by email, so that's not a problem. And do my referees need to upload their reference by the 14th of April? No, they don't. So you just need to submit their contact details on your application form by the 14th of April, and they will be contacted as part of that application process. So if you're not shortlisted, your references won't be contacted. They'll only be contacted if you're shortlisted. And yeah, how are referees contacted? So in the first instance, they're contacted by email. And then if we don't receive a response, we will use a phone number. So that's why we ask for email address and phone number. Okay, fantastic. So we've got another question there, which I will come back to. But what I just want to do is highlight some further support that you can get after today. So we've come to the end of the session and we've covered all of the questions that are in the application form one by one. So hopefully you're now feeling pretty confident about your ability to submit an application. What I am going to do just now is share a link to the feedback form before I tell you about any further resources that are available. These sessions, it's the first time that we've run them. And as a team, we knew that they would be beneficial and we really wanted to run them. But to be able to run them again in the future, we do need some feedback that tells us, first of all, how they were helpful and what was good about them, but then also how we can make them better. So please do share your feedback. You'd be surprised at how many people choose not to do that. And any feedback that we do get is really helpful. So Benita is going to share a link in the chat to the feedback form, but you can also scan the QR code on screen as well. And then whilst you're filling out the feedback form, I'll tell you about other support that's available to help you with this application. Okay. So, application reviews. You've had the session today. We've recorded the session, so we will be making that available on the website shortly. But once you've drafted your application, we really strongly recommend that you get it reviewed by someone. And the peer career support team, Benita is one of them, are running some specific drop-ins just for Find a Solution applications. So on Wednesday, tomorrow, from 11 a.m. until 3 p.m. in the Fraser Building on level 2. And then also on Monday, the 13th of April, from 11 till 3, they're running a drop-in. And if you can't make those drop-ins, the peer career support team run a drop-in every weekday anyway in the Fraser Building from Monday to Friday. Benita, I'm putting you on the spot now and apologies for this, but could you tell people roughly what to expect? So if they come to a drop-in with their application, what can they expect from an appointment with one of you?
So our appointments are generally about 20 minutes. So within those 20 minutes, we'll take a look at your application. We'd ask you some questions, about your motivation for applying, or if you need any help with that. And then we would go through sort of some examples that you could write for this. So a lot of this would be us discussing things and giving you advice, and you can take that advice and then, go ahead and draft your application. So that is sort of what is expected during these appointments. And the support is one-on-one. You will have our full attention. So please feel free to drop by.
Thanks a lot, Benita. This is something that the peer career support team do every single day. They're really good at it. They've all been trained to do it and they do it all the time. So definitely make the most of that support. If you can't get to a drop-in, then you can book an online appointment with a peer as well. So they make appointments available online. Again, they're 20 minutes long, one-to-one, and they're bookable in advance. So if you'd rather have a date booked in, you can book it and then you meet them on Teams, and you share your application with them when you book your appointment. And Jan has asked, can we book an appointment or attend a drop-in without having the draft completed? Yes, absolutely. So even if you've just got started, even if you've not started at all and you just want to come and have a chat about how to get started, that's fine. And the other thing to say with the peer career support team is that you can see them as many times as you like. So if you want to come with an initial draft, get some feedback, go away and improve it and come back and see someone again, you can. You can do that as many times as you want. So yeah, that's a great question, Jan. Fantastic. Now, the other thing that you can do alongside the application reviews is come to the next session. So on Wednesday, the 15th of April, we've got a session on preparing for the interview. Now, what I will say is that you're unlikely to know by the 15th whether or not you've got an interview. The deadline is the 14th. But what we wanted to do was to get this workshop in as soon as possible for people so that they can come, they can have some initial practice, and then if they want to, they can book a follow-up one-to-one conversation with someone before their interview takes place. And the interviews are normally quite quick, so after you've been shortlisted, the turnaround is quite quick. So the next workshop is on the 15th of April, and it's 2 hours long, and it's in person on level 4 of the Fraser Building. We've made this one in person because we're going to have a mock interview activity where you'll get the chance to actually practice answering the kind of questions that are going to come up in the interview. So please book your place on that if you haven't already, if you'd like to come along. And then just a reminder that the peer career support team is available every single weekday until 4:30. So if you can't make the specific drop-ins, you can come along and see them at any other time that suits you. And if you need a little bit more support with your interview practice, or let's say you have a disability or you have specific requirements that mean you might need a little bit longer to talk about your application with someone, then you can also book a career coaching appointment. Now, career coaching appointments are not usually for application reviews. That sits with the peer career support team. But if there are specific requirements that you want to discuss in more detail, then you can book a career coaching appointment. They're 45-minute long and they are available 2 weeks in advance. They do book up really quickly, so you've got to get on there and book in advance. But these can be used to practice your interview skills as well. So book them if you would like to. And that's everything from me, with a little bit of time to spare. So I know we've got a question that's come in already. Benita is going to share a link to the slides again in the chat, and she's also shared a link to the feedback form. So please do provide some feedback if you can. And then we've just got a question here that says, going back to the past experience section, there's a bit that asks what we gained from a role. Is it okay to include a bullet point that says skills gained and then list the skills? Now, yes, that is exactly what we need you to do, but we want you to give evidence. So it's not enough just to say skills gained, time management, communication, teamwork. Each bullet point should focus on a skill and give evidence. So rather than writing time management, collaboration, teamwork, you might have a bullet point that says worked in a team too, and then tell us what you did. Or manage time effectively to juggle, whether it's lots of customers or multiple tasks at the same time or whatever it might be. You need to give us evidence in those bullet points. You need to be specific. So it's not enough just to list the skills. And that is evident. That's advice that we would give for any kind of application, on a CV, on an application form, in an interview. It's not enough to say that you've got the skill. You've got to give us detail of where and how you use that skill. And that is something that we can help you with in the application reviews with the peers. They can help you to add that level of detail to that part of the application form. But that's a really good question. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the session. We've got 7 minutes or so I'm going to hang on. If anyone's got any more questions, they can put them in the Q&A, and we'll answer them before we wrap up. But if you haven't got any questions and you have taken everything that you need from the session, then please feel free to leave. And hopefully we'll see you at the next workshop, if not at one of the drop-ins either tomorrow or on Monday. But thanks so much for coming, everyone. I hope that it's been useful. And good luck with your applications. You're welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming.